And today I'm drinking some Miracle Tree super caffeinated moringa infusion green tea, lemon and ginger. A really super yummy green tea, but more importantly, super caffeinated. And I have D&D tonight, so I have D&D to stay up late. So I have something kind of special for you guys today. If you didn't know, I have a science background. That doesn't really matter, but it felt like it needed to be said. What does matter is that I really like doing spreadsheets and making graphs and analyzing data. So when Elliot Brooks made a video on the accessibility of YA and adult fantasy, I was immediately intrigued by what looked like a research opportunity. Before I get into the meat of my study, the lab report paper that I wrote for this will be linked in the description if you're interested in reading it. It goes into more detail on things than I guess we'll go into in this video, and also it'll give you a closer look at some of the graphs and things like that. So on May 2nd, Elliot Brooks posted a video titled Adult versus YA Fantasy, Accessibility. She used the Goodreads Choice Awards for 2019 and 2018 for YA and adult fantasy, and then she checked Scrib to see if they were available with the intent of determining if, which one is more accessible. She found that there were considerably more of the YA books than the adult books available on Scribs. She also checked the prices on Amazon and found that the YA books were considerably cheaper if you were to buy all 20 books from one of the lists. Check out our video if you want some more details on that. It's a really good video. It'll be in the cards in the description if you want to watch it. And before we go any further, I'm not attacking Elliot Brooks. I'm not trying to say that her video is bad or that I disagree with her or that I think she did a poor job on it. I think it was a brilliant video. I thought it was really interesting and it totally piqued my interest. But I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper than she did. I felt, if anything, her video was just barely scraping the surface of what could really be a much deeper thing. There were a lot of questions that came out of watching that video that I figured I might be able to answer. First one is that, would these trends still hold true if we looked at a greater sample size? Elliot looked at 80 books in total, which is by no means a small amount, but Goodreads has 9 years of data we could pull from, and that's 360 books. So, with all 360 books, do we still see the same trends? Would these same trends exist if we were looking at older novels? Instead of just looking at new releases, stuff that's come out in just the past couple years, if we look at 2012 or 2013 for the books published then, would there be that same imbalance of accessibility? In her video, Elliot excluded digital libraries such as Overdrive, and she had 2 reasons for doing this. One is that if you're looking at it, it's limited accessibility already because not everybody will have access to that library that you're looking at. The other one is that libraries have wait times, especially for popular books or new releases, and she thought that wouldn't be as vital. For me and what I want to do, that latter doesn't matter. Having to wait for a book does not mean, in my opinion, that it's any less accessible. There are tens of thousands of wonderful books out there. Rent another one while you wait. That said, the other one still is important to mention. I have 2 library apps that I'll be looking at, Libby and Your Cloud Library, but it's important to note that I have access to one library on each of those, and they won't necessarily be libraries you have access to. So it's still limited, but I thought it would be interesting to look at. Next one is just how does popularity affect the availability of these books? So by popularity, I'm going to be using the number of reviews on Goodreads. I know this isn't a perfect measure of how popular a book is, but it's fairly good. Goodreads at this point is really widely used, so I think that's a good estimate. My hypothesis here is that YA books tend to be more widely read, more popular, and therefore if there is some trend in how available books are based on popularity, that could be an explanation for why the YA books are more accessible. Finally, while I was collecting this data, I was really interested by the fact that a lot of the books were parts of series, either the sequel or the prequel to another popular book. And so I was kind of interested to see if that had any sort of effect. This ended up being a bit of a non-issue. After I collected all of my data, 59% of the YA novels and 54% of the adult novels were parts of series. They were sequels. And, well, I think there's something really interesting to be said for the fact that the Goodreads Choice Awards have more than half of theirs be sequels, and what that says about the intent of the Goodreads Choice Awards is a whole nother video. But that number, for my purposes, was just a little too close to warrant comparing. Just like Elliot, I decided that the Goodreads Choice Awards was a good place to go to curate my list. If you're interested, a link will be in the description so you can check them out yourself, but on the screen now will be some of the young adult novels and then the adult novels for these lists. I'm not going to read you all 360 titles because that is ridiculous, but feel free to pause and check out what they are. One thing you might notice is that the YA novels, and if you look at Goodreads, the lists are actually for sci-fi and fantasy, whereas the adult novels are all fantasy. There are also some books on this list that I feel don't necessarily fit the age range that they are sorted into, but rather than risk going by my own bias to decide books that might be removed, I chose to stick with what Goodreads said. Obviously, this allows for a bit of a design flaw, but it's what I've got. I gotta say that while making this list, I felt a weird version of nostalgia for a lot of books that I read in like middle school and high school. Like, do you guys remember the Picadus Lore books? I Am Number 4. Almost all of them were on this list, and I never finished the series, so I'm kind of thinking it's time for a reread. On the other hand, it made me feel a little bit like a fake fantasy fan because I hadn't heard of like half of these. I won't bore you with the full details of the methods. If you want to know what statistical tests I did or how I transformed the data, check the lab report in the description. But what you probably will want to know is how I determined if a book was accessible. Like Elliot, I checked if the books were available on Scribd. Note that this applies only to the US. Some of the books did come up as not available in your region or not available in your area, so this is still limited in scope to America. I also checked Libby, which for me and my account is linked to the Westchester Library System in New York. This is a relatively big library, but it's still limiting it. Your Cloud Library is another digital loan service for libraries to use. Mine is linked to the school that I work at. For privacy reasons, I'm not going to tell you where that is, but it's a high school, and so this kind of gave me some diversity in that this is a different region of the United States, and it's a high school rather than a public school. For those two apps, I didn't differentiate between whether the book that was available was ebook or audiobook. I just listed it as available if it was either one. However, I also checked Amazon, and on Amazon I looked for the price of the books and whether or not it was available on Audible. Unlike Elliot, I didn't specify the format of book I was looking for at the cost. I just went with whichever book was cheapest to buy new. Audible had every book but 3 available. Persepolis from 2012, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child from 2016, and The Fantastic Beasts screenplay from 2017. All of these were considered adult books, and if I had to guess, I would say the audiobooks for these either just don't exist, there isn't an audiobook, or they were done independently and are available through like just the author's website or something like that. Then again, at least one of these books probably shouldn't even be on anybody's top list, and I'm not talking about Persepolis. Anyway, this gives us a nice transition to the graphs because the first graph looks so dumb. So what you're looking at here is the number of books out of 20 that were available on Audible for each year. YA is shown in pale gray and adult shown in dark gray. And because Audible had just about everything, it doesn't really look like much. But it does set us up nicely for looking at the rest of the graphs. So all of the digital services had more YA books than adults, but Scribd had the smallest difference out of all of them. On average, there are about 2.5 more young adult books than there were adult fantasy novels available. Interestingly, for Scribd, 2015 is one of only 2 points where there were more adult than YA books available. The other one of those was 2016 on Libby, which also had that trend. Libby had the next highest difference of the list, with an average of 4.5 more YA than adult books. And then there was Your Cloud Library. Your Cloud Library had the biggest difference by far. There were nearly 9 more young adult than adult novels on average. And while I can't quite explain the difference on the others, this one makes a lot of sense to me. My Your Cloud Library is linked to a high school, and it makes sense for them to have more books at the young adult range because, well, they're catering to young adults. So this graph looks fairly similar, but this is the average cost of the books. So rather than adding everything up for the year the way Elliot did, I averaged out the cost per book and still found that on average the YA books were cheaper than the adult books. On average, it was about $1.64 cheaper to get the YA books than the adult books. It's not a huge difference, but it's still something. One theory I have for this is the target audience of the books. Teenagers and young adults on average make less money than adults, so if you're trying to target them, it makes sense for you to charge less because they don't have as much to spend. My other idea is what I think is the more common theory, which is that the production of adult books just cost more. I don't know how true that one is, but I'm really interested to do a separate analysis on page count to cost of books, and then looking at page count of young adult versus adult books. That's for another day, but I'm also very interested in doing that research. So what about the popularity of a book? Well, honestly, this section is a bit of a mess. I would encourage you to go check out the full doc for the rest of the figures on this because I'm only going to show you the one. But what it looks like is that more popular books tend to be more available. And YA books, on average, had almost 3 times as many reviews on Goodreads as the adult books did. Here's the thing though, that's not super useful because I have no way of knowing whether popularity of books makes them available on more services or if books that are available on more services become more popular. What I'm saying is I don't know which is the cause and which is the effect. To determine which is causing which here would take a much longer study on looking at things about when these books become available on these services and how the popularity changes as a result. And, well, if somebody wants to spend 5 years doing that, I'll give you the idea for free, but it's really just not for me. So let's take a look back on those questions from the beginning. Does the trend of Scribd having more YA books than adult books hold true if we have a wider range to look at? Yeah, well, sort of. At least for Goodreads Choice Awards top 20 fantasy picks. The problem is that this isn't really a random list of books at all. I'll spare you the lecture on what it means to be truly random or how a sample group is supposed to be decided and gathered. But really, if we wanted this to be a more accurate study, we would take like a list of all the books published that year and use like a number generator or something to pick out random ones. The point being is that a totally different group of books might have given us completely different results. So we'll say yes to this one, but with an asterisk that says, well, actually, does the inequality between young adult and adult fantasy novels stay the same over time? Well, no, it doesn't stay the same. It's not like there's a consistency to it that every year there was 3 to 4 books more. But from year to year, despite that fluctuation, it does consistently show more young adults than adult fantasy novels available. Do digital library services also have this issue? Well, yeah, kind of. Actually, in some ways it seems worse, at least, well, it's worse for me specifically. Again, we're limiting this to the libraries I have access to. But what you might have already noticed that I didn't mention earlier is that there is a big difference between the number of books period available on Scribd versus these other services. While Scribd had the lowest difference between the number of YA and adult books, it also had the fewest books available. Scribd had only 197 of the 360 books, whereas Libby had 265 and Your Cloud Library had 214. And yes, A lot of these popular books, especially the new ones, had long wait times. But that's better than not getting the book at all, right? So get a library card, see what services your library provides, and support your local library. Anyway, rant over, moving on. So final question here is, does the popularity of a book affect its availability? Well, maybe. There does seem to be a trend between the two, but I couldn't tell you which is affecting which. So that's really all I have for you. Traditionally, a lab report ends with ideas for further research on the topic. I have a few ideas myself, but what about you? Is there some bookish question you want me to answer for you with spreadsheets? I really, really love doing these, so please give me your ideas in the comments. I also did one on the Wheel of Time a few years ago. If you're familiar with the Wheel of Time or the Wheel of Time fandom at all, you have probably heard of the slog. I did a bit of a research project on that one, and I'll link the report for that one in the description too. It's a few years old and probably should be redone, but if you're interested, give it a read. And that's it for now. Bye.